Alright, so we got that pushed on. I'm going to tell you, a 2-inch socket was just barely big enough to get down on, because you want to get down on this area here. You want to be pushing down here. So a 2-inch just caught that. 2 1/4 probably be better. But well, what I got. So don't forget to put this spacer back on here. And then this can go back on into the tail shaft. Like so. And then I'm going to go back in. I get a socket that fits this inner race, and we will push that into the tail shaft. But again, I'm not going to video it. You guys have seen all this. Well, that went on a lot easier than I thought it would. I got a large, deep socket that was bigger than the splines, and I got a large, deep socket that was bigger than the splines, but still rode on the edge of that inner bearing race. And it pushed really easy. Probably could have driven it with a dead blow hammer or something. Again, you do not want to use a metal hammer on these things. So this is the sprawl clutch. I've actually had it out of here already, but I thought I should go over this. It was locked in here just because that's how the car was parked. So you just had to tap it counterclockwise to push the rollers down off their ramp. And once I had done that, you can lift it out. And if you were not going to replace all the rollers, then you need to, as you lift it up, put something on to keep the rollers inside of the cage, because otherwise they're just going to all fall out. So there's the cage. Here are all the rollers. So I've used zip ties to hold this all together. It'll make your life a lot easier. You're definitely going to have to use zip ties or something to reassemble it, because otherwise there's just no way to hold all these 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, there's about 14 rollers here. There's just no way to hold them and get them in. So you put a zip tie on them, just barely snug. And once you get them started, then as you push the cage down, you can pull the zip tie up and off of the rollers. So I'm going to I bought new rollers. And I want to take this apart. There's a spring in here too, to take a look at the surfaces, make sure everything's okay. And I'm going to do the same in here. So then I'll do that and we'll get back to you. Here's the cage. I just wanted to show you the spring is like 270 degrees, but there's one end poking up through here, and the other end goes in through the side of the bearing. Here it is. And it's right there, and there's a little hole. So as I lift that up, I can remove that. So there's that spring. If you buy new bearings, you should get a new spring too, because they're very inexpensive. So there it is. It goes in that way with the taper facing up. And this is the inner sprawl clutch, and you can see there's a series of ramps, and what it is under power, this turns and it locks the rollers into the cage, and it's for the transmission of the power. And so that, particularly like in first gear and stuff, when you've got greatly amplified power coming through the transmission, this is a much stronger clutch than the cone clutches that are on the overdrive. So as you can see, there's some shiny spots on those ramps, which is where the rollers usually go, but the shiny spots are in the middle. And I don't see any big chips missing or anything like that. So this is a good clutch. You know, if it was worn, you would see that those shiny spots would be coming up towards this edge as it wears. And eventually, if it wore enough, then this would spin. So yeah, it's got shiny, spots on it from showing where the rollers have been pushed into the roller all these years, but they're not excessive. I'm sure that there's, a couple of thousands of divot there, but that's okay. It works fine like that. The other thing I want to talk about is this is the thrust washer that was at the back. It sits under here, right? good idea to replace this too. I've often found that this is in 4 pieces. It has these notches in the surface, which is for oiling. And like I say, they both have that. But I've often found these in multiple pieces. That's why I didn't want to leave the cone clutch in there. I thought at first I was going to leave it. Just, it looked good. And then the more I thought about it was, yeah, I probably should. And then I say, look at that wear. So the next thing we're going to do is put the sun wheels back in. And I don't think this overdrive will say that. Well, maybe it does. If you look very carefully right there, there's a little divot, somebody with a center punch hit that gear, and there should be one of those on each of these gears. So when you've got this installed, those 3 dots are supposed to be facing inward, perpendicular to a line through the center of this shaft. So I can tell you that's going to take a few tries to get that down, because these are helically cut, so as you rotate them in, they're going to spin a little bit. So there's no explanation given for why those are like that, but it's got to have to do with the machining of all this stuff, because they all should turn the same amount as we lower them in, right? The trick is to get them all to engage at the same time. It's real easy to get 2, but to get 3 is a different story. Well, there we go, there's 3. How do my dots look? Well, I'm surprised that went easier than I thought. Let's get you guys. And if you look, those are all facing inward. So I got lucky. It went pretty easy that time. Next, you want to push the sun gear into this basket. And this basket goes on the tail shaft. And you want to make sure that the gear engaged with that back hub, which this one has. So that's in. And then this goes on next. And remember, the taper goes towards the tail shaft. There it is. And you're going to have to, it's a really snug fit. You're going to have to drive that home. So you want to make sure that all these surfaces are spotless, because that's how it seals. And then I'm going to put just a touch of sealant right down in that very edge. I'm not going to hardly use any at all, but just a little bit. I could say I've had a problem in the past with these leaking past. So yeah, you don't want to put much, because if you put too much in, it's going to change how far this sets off that back, which changes all the shims. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I think I should just mention that ring, I believe, is cast iron. I don't know that for sure, but it sure looks like it. And cast iron is really brittle, so you want to be careful. So I'll put just a little bit of sealant on that inside edge. This is my soft mallet again, just working my way around. And that's got all of it home. So next is to put this piece on. So you want to make sure you don't lose that bit of that bearing, because it'll fall off pretty easy. I guess we could try to reach our fingers through, hang on to it. I took the centerpiece of the brake ring and did it on the wire wheel, because what I found was it had a solid layer of gasket sealer on it, and that would have added 3/4 thousandths of an inch. And I just wanted to make sure it was really clean. And it is cast iron, so it's a lot harder than the wheels of the It's a lot harder than the wire brush. So as you put that down, I don't know how well you can see this. There are 4 studs that go through that center bridge. You want to make sure those are lined up all right. These other long studs are the ones the springs go back over. So anyway, we've got those in. And hopefully this thing should... Looks like we're hanging up on something. I have to pull this up and turn it a couple of times, and you can see how much lower it is in there now. And that's why that plate wasn't fitting all the way the last time. So let's try that again. Oh yeah, they're not even a 1/4 inch now. There we go, that's on all the way. So we're just going to go around now and put all these nuts back on and washers, and of course we will Loctite them. And a quick mention here, this is the operating shaft for the overdrive, and before you go too much further, you want to make sure that this little arm that's on this long lever is under there, because I just happened to notice mine, this had turned when we had, this is that 12-point socket that holds all that together. So when we had all that apart, this arm had slid up and that arm came out from underneath it. So right now it's really easy to fix. Is I undid that 10-point or 12-point socket and took the spring and the ball bearing out and just moved this up, move that down. But if you don't notice that till the overdrive is assembled on transmission, you are going to hate life. Next we're going to work on the actuating pistons. These have O-ring seals. We're just going to pull them off and just using this little scratch awl to get underneath because they're tight. We just get that under there, pry that O-ring up over the top, and then new O-rings to fit over the head crown of the piston. And slide those in like so. And then we're going to take some lubricating oil, going to lubricate the bores, and then we're also going to lubricate the O-rings on the pistons. So get them on there and just spread it around nice and even. Don't need a lot. Put it into the bore, and then we'll just push it home like this. And this is the assembly. So we're also going to install these bridge pieces. This is how the actuating pistons push against the bridge pieces that pull the studs that are attached to the actuating clutches for the sun and planetary gears. So I don't know if they really have a one way or not, but these had the little shiny marks from the center of the piston, so put them back the same. Then these are those little nut locks, and then we'll put a little Loctite in, and then we're going to use those low profile nuts that came with it, and just slide them on and tighten them up. And there you go. This is the pump body, and I've also screwed the adapter we made up to pull it out. We're going to use it to push it back in. I've also made up these 2 pins to align the pump body. They go through the holes for the retaining screws. So we just get it started, make sure it's all facing in the correct direction. Make sure it's going to fit. This is the actuating pump and a new spring. This has to go on before you place the pump body in because it won't clear that bushing. You can also see that little pad underneath the bushing. That's what keeps the piston in alignment. So here we go. Here's the new piston going in. That's the big end, is the roller end. Goes into the body. And just get it started. Get the slide hammer in place, put it on a firm surface, and you'll notice I'm not hitting it very hard. I'm just sort of tapping it in, taking my time. We're not in a big rush. We don't need to beat anything to death. And you see that's moving quite readily. I keep checking to make sure that the actuating piston is not wedging in or anything and bending it or anything, because it's a pretty expensive part. And it's all going good. Just tap, 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 and there we go. Just take the slide hammer back off, and there it is, all in place. We just need to use the 2 screws to hold it in. Of course, we use a little Loctite on it. Next, we're going to work on the accumulator piston, and that's the accumulator on the right. Is that round hole going all the way down, and that's what feeds from the actuating pump. So this piston uses steel rings. They're multi-parts. The inner rings are actually, I think, the springs. That's these wider ones. And then there's a thinner one that goes on, a pair of thinner ones that go on top. So just carefully, because rings do like to break, we'll put the first one on, and then we'll put the outer ring on top of that. And these are tiny things, so you really got to be gentle with them. And we're going to try and keep all the piston joints clocked from each other so that none of them line up. So there's two smaller rings go on top of that first spring ring, and of course we'll separate those joints from each other as well. And just get that down in there like that. And then once that's in place, we'll put, well, this is how they come from the factory. So the inner and outers are stacked on top of each other, I think, to give them strength in the shipping so they don't break. So you take them apart, and this is the inner ring, and that goes on, and then we put the two smaller rings on. So now we're going to have 6 rings in total, and we need to spread all the gaps around evenly so we have the best sealing possible. Not that a little bit of leakage pass is just going back into the transmission, so it's not crazy critical, but it's nice to have it right. Next, we're going to put a little bit of lubricating oil on the springs. We'll spread the rings, and then we'll spread it around, and then we'll put some down in the bore as well. Get right in there nice and deep, and then we'll lower the piston in. The top of the bore has a taper on it, so we shouldn't need any ring compressors or anything, and that just sort of gently faces down into the bore, and then we'll put that washer on top, and then we're ready to put the springs in. Well, this washer is not shown in the diagrams, but it was in the bottom of the hole here on top of the piston, between the piston and the springs. So I'm going to go with that's where it belongs. But this hole matches up with the hole in the piston, which I believe leads through to the back of the piston rings to lubricate them. And we get the big spring and the little spring. And then we're going to have a gasket, which is here, and I need to put some gasket sealer on. And also I noticed that looks like an O-ring in there. And it is. There's a little O-ring there, so you want to make sure you replace that. Okay, so we got that placed sitting on top of the springs, and that's what these 2 extra long screws are for. And that's how you draw that down. So we're going to use a socket on that. So you're basically just gonna, you want to walk this down evenly. So you run these down till they both touch. There we go, they're both touching. And then I'll run them down a turn or 2 at a time, making sure it doesn't hang up on any of these other. There's 3 other bolts here. You want to check your clearance of the thrust bearing, which is a little hard to see. It's down there. It's right about down there. So there should only be a few thousandths clearance there. So if you got a big gap, then you forgot something. There should be a spacer and a bronze bushing. And if it's too tight, then the output won't turn. So you can reach down there with I got a right angle pick right here. I know it's hard for you to see. But right there is the edge of the brass one. And I can see it's not dragging, but I can't see it move, which tells me there's just a few thousandths clearance. So that's a good thing. So the next thing I want to do is to reinstall, this is the speedometer drive. And I put a new O-ring on there as a standard size O-ring. I pulled one out of my Jegs multi-list. I'm going to put some lube on it, and you want to get it so that that divot on the top lines up with that hole there. And this just push it down. Helps you put it the right way around. And then that just pushes in. And remember, we had a special bolt for that. And that should just go out, put a little Loctite on it. And that should just go right on there. And we just need to push that O-ring in a bit further so it'll catch. So I need 2 hands to do that. So hang on. So I get that in, and it did give it just a touch of wrench to pull it because it's a really close fit. It's only a couple of thousandths extra, so my greasy fingers wouldn't turn it, but I put a wrench on it, turned really easy, and you felt it go into the hole. So this is where the oil reservoir for the pump is. So you look, you can see there's an O-ring down there, but you also see that it does not cover up that communicating hole between this reservoir and the main body, and that's for the oil to come down. There's also some oil coming through that smaller hole between those 2 bolts, the big bolt and the little bolt. So this O-ring had to stretch over that boss, not by much. It's probably in diameter about a 1/16 of an inch smaller. So it's just a snug fit, and that keeps it away from the edge of that hole. Then there's these 3, they're like a plastic rubber. They're like refrigerator magnets is really what they are, because I believe they are magnetic. Yeah, just lightly. So I took those apart and cleaned all them. This is the big brass plug. Clean that up a little bit. These go in here. Nice and centered. All right. You can see that cleaned up quite a bit better. Had to do it from the outside in because it was caught between that coarse mesh and the fine mesh. So that drops in this side up, pin in the center of this, and that goes into the center of that. So that just goes on like this. Make sure it's not cross-threaded. It's awful easy to cross-thread these things. And just feel it snugging up just before the gap closes, and that's because it's crushing down on that washer. Now, I suppose I probably put my C-wrench away, but you use a C-wrench to tighten this up. Now I just noticed Overdrive Repair Services in Sheffield, England sells a wrench for these. It's about 20 bucks. It's a little expensive, but it's a lot better than buggering this up and having to find a new one of these. Overdrive Services in England, when Normanville de Laycock decided not to make overdrives anymore, I don't know if the whole company went out of business, but the overdrive division was closing up. A group of employees bought the overdrive division and all the spares decades ago. And they carry almost everything for these, including adapter plates and main shafts for TR, so you can do the conversion. I've done business with them for a long time. That you can do it on the internet now, which is a lot easier. In the old days, I would have to get up about 5:30 in the morning, because don't forget, England is 8 hours ahead of us in California, and speak with a gentleman at the parts counter who has a Sheffield accent you could cut with an axe. So fortunately, I have relatives that were Geordies and Yorkshiremen, and so I speak a third language, apparently, Yorkshire, Northern England. But believe me, at 6 o'clock in the morning, it was difficult. So I feel pity for anybody that hadn't been exposed to. It's still English, but boy, there's a lot of slang and an accent like crazy. Anyway, website makes it really easy. They ship stuff really pretty fast. Prices are pretty reasonable. If you can find the parts at Overdrive Services, chances are you're going to pay less than you do from any of the other big suppliers, because I don't think they give anybody a discount. I think they all just sell for the same price, and of course the suppliers mark it up. Not that you shouldn't use the suppliers. I mean, certainly if you need one little piece and you're ordering a bunch of other stuff, it's cheaper to pay a little bit more for that than to pay the separate freight. But, you know, do what you feel is fit. Anyway, we'll put that on. I'm going to go find my wrench and tighten that up. Well, next we need to put this rear seal on. Not all these bearings are in the right spot. So it just goes up on there. I did lubricate that inner lip, by the way. It's really tough to do after it's on the car. We can just work it around and tap it home. Make sure that it's flush all the way around. It's just a couple of thousandths below, so that's good. Now we'll get to see how good a job I did cleaning up the rear flange. So as you recall, one of these keys in here was buggered up. So anyway, I'm just going to wipe this down, and then we're going to put a little oil right here on that surface. Well, I was curious. I had another one of these laying around in the box of parts. I grabbed it, and it's snug, but not as bad. You can see I can kind of push it down. So apparently it's something that's happened to the shaft, and like we know the shaft was buggered up when we took it apart. So you got it on far enough. You can draw it down with the nut. Well, it was 1 1/4 inches. I just didn't have it centered right. So there it is. There it is, driven home. So it still turns. And of course, I'm halfway on one of the holes for the cotter pin. That looks about right. So I just got to put the cotter pin on, but I think you guys know how to do that. So the last thing to do is to set the solenoid. So this is the opposite side from the solenoid. There's this lever, and you'll notice there's a hole in the casing. This is a 3/16 drill bit, I think. That fits through the hole. You want to pull that down until those two holes engage. I'm not actually going to put my solenoid on because I need a new boot for it, and it's not here yet, but I will show you. So this arm is just on here loose right now. You feed that through and then hook the arm onto it. There we go. Then you would bolt the solenoid down, and then you want to pull that up all the way and that down tight into it, and then tighten this bolt, and that's the adjustment. If you do this wrong and try to make the arm pull further, it will burn the solenoid out because the solenoid's 2 stages. So there's a set of points in there, and in their relaxed state, like this, they turn the main coil on. So when you flip the overdrive switch, it pulls really hard. But once it's up there, it doesn't take much energy to hold it there. So when it comes up, it trips the points over to the other side, and it turns off the main coil, turns on a much smaller holding coil that will just hold that up. And it doesn't need as much power just to hold it as it does to change it. But as you can see, I need to get a couple of boots for this, so there's not much point in that. But that's pretty straightforward. Big trick is to set up the 3/16 drill bit on the opposite side just to hold it in the correct position. You'll feel it. The holes will be about half off, and that's where that little lever arm on the inside just starts to touch. So this is the actuating rod for the overdrive right there. So you'll feel that come touch that, and then that last half a hole worth of rotation pushes that and lifts the ball here that allows the passage of oil to the hydraulic cylinders, which pull the cage forward, which engages the overdrive. Here's the ball bearing that's part of the one-way valve for the pump. Goes at the base of the accumulator housing. This is the spring retainer in the spring. So it goes on top of the ball bearing, just threads down into the bottom of the hole here. It actually goes into the side of the pump body. So this video is getting long enough. I'm not going to show you how to put it back onto the transmission. That's not that big a deal. You just want to make sure you put the cam onto the shaft so that when you put it together, you have to make sure the cam is facing up, because otherwise it's going to interfere with the plunger on the oil pump. And then it just bolts together the same way you took it apart. But this video is probably half an hour long now, and that's way longer than it should be. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, and we'll see you on the next one.